Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has finally made good on a campaign promise. He's now raised tariffs of 25% on Canada and Mexico and 10% on China. But that has triggered retaliation from all three countries. They have now levied counter tariffs on American goods. Trump says that Americans may feel some economic pain from these tariffs, but he argued it would be worth the price to secure American interests. But would this actually make America great again, or will it make China great again? I decode. The United States, under the Trump administration, has hit its two closest neighbors, Mexico and Canada, with 25% tariffs. From honey to tomatoes, from clothes to toilet seats, a wide range of American goods that cross the border into Canada and Mexico have been hit with a 25% tariff. Oil and gas products, a bulk of which America imports from Canada, are being hit at a slightly less rate of 10% tariffs. Trump has also said that he's going to hit China with 10% tariffs. All of these tariffs will be effective from midnight of 4th of February. Trump has said that the tariffs are intended to reduce the flow of the deadly opioid fentanyl over the border, as well as cutting down the flow of illegal immigrants, both from Mexico and Canada.
We may have short-term a little pain, and people understand that, but long-term, the United States has been ripped off by virtually every country in the world. We have deficits with almost every country, not every country, but almost, and we're going to change it.
In turn, both Canada and Mexico have hit back with retaliatory tariffs on American goods that are crossing over the border. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau tried to speak directly to the American consumer and tried to appeal to stop what he called a tariff madness.
Canada will be responding to the U.S. trade action with 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods. This will include immediate tariffs on $30 billion worth of goods as of Tuesday, followed by further tariffs on $125 billion worth of American products in 21 days' time to allow Canadian companies and supply chains to seek to find alternatives.
China, too, has said it's going to take corresponding countermeasures. The U.S. International Trade Commission estimated that tariffs on key imports from Canada and Mexico could lead to a net loss of over 200,000 jobs over the next 4 years. The Bureau of Economic Analysis projects that U.S. GDP growth could decline anywhere between 0.5% to a full percentage point annually if these tariffs lead to a full-blown trade war. Meanwhile, that's not the only problem. Inflation, too, could rise by an extra 1 or 2 percentage points, putting on additional pressure on household budgets, which are already stretched thin. In fact, one of the reasons why Trump was voted to office for a second term was because of rising prices of groceries, including eggs. Every tariff is a tax on the American consumer. Every tariff disrupts supply chains and it reduces productivity. The cumulative effect of these tariffs could be disastrous for both American industry and the American consumer. Take the steel industry as a case in point. When tariffs on steel and aluminum were imposed on American steel that was being imported from Canada as well as from Mexico when Trump was in his first term, the prices of steel surged by nearly 30%. Construction companies, as a result of that, were forced to delay projects. Housing starts fell. The ripple effect was felt across the U.S. economy, from builders to real estate agents to mortgage lenders. In fact, the National Association of Home Builders warned that rising material costs could reduce new home construction by up to 10% over the next 2 years. And that is not a problem that is confined to just one industry, it is an economy-wide crisis. In 2023, American exports to Canada and Mexico accounted for nearly 30% of all of America's total exports. Losing even a small share of this market could mean the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs. Also, Canada and Mexico could then look for more export destinations, the European Union, or even possibly China, thereby defeating the very purpose of these tariffs by Trump. A Congressional Research Service report has warned that escalating trade war between the three North American neighbors, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, could shrink US GDP anywhere between 0.5% to 1% annually. A study by the Economic Policy Institute found that every 1% increase in tariff could lead to a 0.2% decline in manufacturing employment. In fact, in 2022, nearly 12 million American jobs were linked to international trade, according to data that's available from the US International Trade Commission. So what are the imports from Canada? The total value of goods imported from Canada into the United States was a little over $300 billion in 2022. Some of the major items imported from Canada include energy products, crude oil, natural gas, refined petroleum products, and coal. In fact, more than 60% of all crude that is imported into the United States comes from Canada. And that's perhaps why Trump has been careful to impose only 10% tariffs on petroleum products, but 25% on all other imports from Canada. Vehicles and automotive parts are the other big import. In fact, the car manufacturing industry is so tightly run across these three countries that to make a fully finished car, the assembly line runs between these three countries up to 4 or 5 times before a fully manufactured car hits the American market. The US Chamber of Commerce estimates that such tariffs would push up the cost of an average car by as much as $1,500 to $2,000 per car. And that is not a small number. There's also industrial machinery and components that are essential for manufacturing, which are imported from Canada. And then there is forestry products, lumber and wood products, which are crucial for construction. Aluminum and other raw materials are also used in various industries. In fact, aluminum in particular is the biggest imported metal from Canada into the United States. US exports to Canada and to Mexico were over $500 billion in 2022 and imports over $600 billion. That is a combined net trade between the three North American neighbors of over $1 trillion. In his first term, Trump had pushed both Canada and Mexico to renegotiate NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, one of the longest-running FTAs in the world. That has been in place since 1994. A new agreement was arrived at. It was called the US-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, but it ended up driving prices higher up, particularly in steel and aluminum, sometimes by as much as 30%. A report by the American Economic Association concluded that protectionist policies were reducing marketing efficiency and also slowing down the pace of innovation. When companies are shielded from competition, they are less motivated to improve and to become more productive. They become less productive and perhaps sometimes even complacent. Tariffs may protect some jobs in the short term, but overall, they harm the competitive edge of the American economy. Reduced competitiveness means slower growth. Slower growth means fewer new jobs in the long haul. Those very same industries which Trump is vowing to protect with all these tariffs will eventually fall behind in a globalized market. Already, the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Nova Scotia have announced that they are pulling out all American beer, wine, and spirits from government-owned liquor stores. Higher prices also mean higher inflation. Inflation, in fact, is a silent tax on every American citizen. The Federal Reserve has been battling inflation for years. In 2023, core inflation hovered between 4 and 5%. With tariffs forcing up input costs, inflationary pressures will only mount. In fact, the Heritage Foundation has published an economic outlook which says that tariffs could push overall inflation up by anywhere between 1 to 2 percentage points over the next 4 years. Higher inflation squeezes middle-class families. It reduces their purchasing power. It forces consumers to spend more on basic necessities and less disposable income. In a country where the average household spends over $3,000 a year just on transportation, even small increases in the price of gas or in the price of new cars can have a major impact. History has shown that free trade works. The numbers don't lie. In nominal terms, US GDP has grown substantially since the early 1990s when it had the North America Free Trade Agreement. For example, in 1990, the United States nominal GDP was roughly $6 trillion. By 2023, nominal GDP in America had grown to around $30 trillion. Hyper-protectionism is a dead end. It's a path that leads to higher prices, fewer jobs, and eventually economic decline. It will not make America great again, as Trump promises to do. It will only lead to another American recession. All right, joining us now is CNN White House correspondent Kevin Liptak. Thank you very much, Kevin, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. So the United States has announced tariffs of 25% on both Canada and Mexico. Canada has, of course, announced its own retaliatory tariffs. I believe Mexico will be revealing its retaliatory tariffs later today. Trump says he hopes to speak with both Prime Minister Trudeau and President Sheinbaum sometime today. Do we know when that conversation is slated for? And can they still pull back from the brink of a trade war before these tariffs kick in midnight Tuesday?
Yeah, well, we expect those phone calls to happen this morning, Eastern time here in Washington, but Donald Trump himself sort of tamped down expectations that they could result in anything like a reprieve from these tariffs that are set to take effect at midnight Eastern time. He said he didn't expect anything dramatic to come out of these phone calls, essentially saying that he is going full bore ahead with these 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, the 10% tariffs on China. There is a carve out on Canadian energy that will only be applied a 10% tariff. But I think, this is a significant step that the president is taking. In one way, it does fulfill something that he said he would do as a candidate, which is to try and rebalance global trade. He says that these tariffs are necessary to curb the flow of illicit drugs and migrants across American borders, but he is essentially also saying that another of his top campaign promises, which was to lower prices for Americans, may just have to wait. And you've heard him acknowledge that over the past 24 hours, saying that Americans may experience some of what he calls pain from these tariffs, but that it will be worth it in the end to accomplish these goals. Now, this conversation with Trudeau in particular, I think, will be very interesting. We did hear from the Canadian Prime Minister over the weekend that he had been trying to get in touch with Trump since Inauguration Day 2 weeks ago, and that his calls weren't being picked up. And so this will be an important moment for the two men to talk. I think the big frustration among Canadian officials, Mexican officials as well, is that Donald Trump hasn't explicitly said what he is looking for in order for these tariffs to be eased up, what quantifiable metric he is trying to get to curb the flow of migrants, to curb the flow of fentanyl across the borders. That has left them sort of in the dark about how they can avoid what could be a potentially withering trade war in North America.
So other than Mexico and Canada, he's also imposed 10% tariffs on China. Now he's set his sights on Europe, in particular the European Union. He says, quoting him, has been ripping America off. So if Trump is going to put tariffs on some of America's biggest trading partners from Canada, Mexico, China, and next possibly the European Union, wouldn't it ultimately hurt the U.S. consumer? The average American consumer would end up paying more for groceries and cars and gas at the pump.
Yeah, that's certainly what many and most economists say will happen. In fact, Donald Trump now is saying it himself, that this pain will be inflicted on Americans, at least in the short term. And I think it's important to note that the North American economy in particular is just so integrated when it comes to car manufacturing, when it comes to energy production. In fact, there are oil refineries in the northern part of the United States that are designed specifically to refine Canadian oil. All of this will end up costing American companies more, and they are expected to pass that cost on to American consumers.